Welcome back to Presidents in Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined by former Congressman Ross, our other host. And today we are jumping into the sixth President of the United States, John Quincy Adams.
Interesting man.
Yes.
The first of the Founding Fathers' offspring to become president. Probably the last of the Founding Fathers' offspring to become president. But unique guy. They all were very unique.
Yes.
And he came about. You understand his father lost an election, a re-election to Thomas Jefferson that was very
Hard fought.
divided, very hard fought. But this man comes in with a deep history of political networking. I mean, I believe it was Washington that appointed him to the minister of the Netherlands or something.
The Netherlands, that's correct. Yeah.
And then when his father's president, he appoints him to the ambassador to Prussia, which is today's Germany. And he works in just about every administration and was very influential with crafting the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, and buying Florida.
And buying Florida,
purchasing Florida
under James Monroe when he was president. So here's a guy that I think always knew he was destined to be president. At least that's what he
believed.
He believed.
Yes.
Like a lot of our founding fathers that you pointed out, John Quincy Adams was predominantly self-educated, but very well educated.
Very well educated.
And I guess he spoke 5 languages, I think.
He spoke Russian, French, Italian, Latin, and Greek. Yeah, so five languages. I mean, he did this by the age of 14. By the age of 14, he could speak 5 languages. He's actually translating for his father as a secretary at the age of 14.
Isn't that amazing?
And then look at the immaturity of our youth today. I mean, we talk about the delayed adolescence of America, but that can really be seen.
Well, think about today. They're not even teaching cursive writing.
No.
How does one sign their name? What does a signature look like if you don't know how to write in
printed
cursive
with
writing?
A squiggle? I don't know.
It's just an X, I guess, from just reverting back.
Which this brings up an interesting point. And one thing I wanted to bring up is John Quincy Adams is only one of 2 presidents who had a father who was a president.
Yes.
And it's interesting for a few reasons. First of all, you would think with the idea of monarchy, with the idea of hereditary leadership, this would happen more often. However, history usually bears out, I'll say this with my classes, history bears out that really great men and great women usually have sorry kids.
Yes.
And that's an interesting thought. Like, I don't know really why that is. Is it because they had life too easy? Is it because they were in too big of a shadow? I'm not sure what it is that produces that. But
I think it's the latter. I think it's the shadow that the next generation lives under, and they just don't feel competent or capable enough to live that life. And I see that happening to some. You look at some of the great people, the Roosevelts, the Eisenhowers.
Yes.
Some of them do well. Even Lincoln's son, I mean, but that's a pretty high bar to achieve. I mean, the odds of being president are incredibly, difficult. And then to be the son of a president who becomes president is even, more remote in terms of the chances. And it has happened in the United States twice, of course, with John Adams and his son, and then George Bush and his son. But
both named after their father. It's an interesting coincidence, by the way. The only times it's happened, they were namesake carriers. One of the things I thought about is the idea of being intentional with parenting. And one of the things that John Adams Sr. did with John Quincy Adams was he made him part of his campaign and part of his work early on.
Yes.
In fact, at the age of 10, John Adams Sr. takes John Quincy Adams to France with him. Yeah. It's one of the places he learns French very early on, and it was a very arduous journey. The ship was actually struck by lightning.
Yeah,
I don't know if you read this or not on the way.
I read that in the David McCullough book of John Adams. He talks about that.
The ship is struck by lightning. 4 crew members are killed. It's attacked by a British ship. They get stuck in like a hurricane, and all these kind of hardships.
Welcome to politics.
Yeah, right.
You're gonna love it.
Exactly. It's great. It's an easy road, isn't it? But it kind of is like these hardships that kind of crafts him. And John Adams Sr., speaking about this, made this statement: "I wanted to give the boy international experience and provide a second generation of enlightened leadership in the U.S."
Wow.
I want to give a second generation of enlightened leadership. I like that. He was very intentional in the way that he brought his son along with him. And maybe that's why he ended up becoming president and a leader. Now, John Quincy Adams, he's not quite as successful with his children. He has 4.
Right.
And 2 of those sons become alcoholics.
Well, and then I guess one dies at birth and he has 2 daughters that die. But...
And then one son we're not sure, it's mysterious, probably died of suicide. They think that he jumped off of a bridge. And he was named for the namesake of George Washington. Which John Adams Sr. is kind of angry about. He kind of gets ticked off about it because he, names his grandson after George Washington instead of him, and he's always lived in the shadow of George Washington anyway. So there's this whole kind of drama, like soap opera thing going on here. But John Quincy Adams is a very interesting man.
It is, but I think what's really interesting, we talk about divine intervention or coincidence.
The providential hand. Yes.
However you want to look at this, but here is a guy that is the first generation of the Founding Fathers and becomes the first president after the last Founding Father was president.
That is cool.
And you just wonder if the stage wasn't set, to make that transition again for John Quincy Adams to be the bridge for the next generation to come through. Now his presidency was marred with controversy.
The corrupt deal,
the corrupt bargain,
the corrupt bargain.
I think that was the last time, and correct me if I'm wrong, that was the last time that the House of Representatives had to elect a president.
Yes, off the top of my head, I believe you're correct on that. It's come close a few times, though.
Oh, it's come close.
Very close. And there's been, talk of that happening in our recent past as well. So
yeah, when I was in the legislature in 2000, I was elected in 2000 to the Florida legislature, which was the Bush v. Gore debacle.
Okay, yes,
and the center of the political universe was in Tallahassee, Florida, and it was up to us. We had, to find out whether those hanging chads or pregnant chads would justify the voters' intent to determine who was going to be the next president, because our body of electoral votes was the one that was going to make the decision. And here we are in the legislature. We can't. The Secretary of State can't certify the results. It's in litigation both in the United States Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court. And we're going into special session to pass a resolution appointing a slate of electors. And if we didn't do that, then not necessarily would it go to the Congress, but our votes wouldn't be counted, and there's no way Florida was going to not have their votes counted.
Absolutely.
But if it was a tie, then of course the House of Representatives would have decided, and that was the last time when John Quincy Adams was elected, and he gets elected. Andrew Jackson gets the most votes, and the popular vote,
popular and electoral, both.
Popular,
both.
yes, but not a majority.
No,
and so therefore it goes, and then Henry Clay is Speaker of the House.
Yes.
Throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, and Jackson starts these rumors that Henry Clay is going to be Secretary of State.
Which, in all honesty, Clay was a very competent guy. He was good at what he did. He just got kind of hung up in the midst of this. Yeah, I wrote down the exact number. So John Quincy Adams only got 113,000 in the popular vote.
Wow.
Only 113,000. So to put that in perspective, for Florida, we had like 4.5 million that voted for DeSantis in the last election. Which, granted, we have to realize the population difference between 1824 versus now.
It's true.
But still, when you look at the amount of numbers that were truly voted, that's one of the reasons why he is so, I don't want to use the term unpopular, because he had some decent policies, but he has a hard time getting support, both in Congress and among the general populace.
And that's interesting, because he was the driving force behind many of the policies that preceded him.
Yes.
The Louisiana Purchase.
Absolutely.
The Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
The
Purchase of Florida. Some of the Oregon Coast, actually, he'll buy as well.
Yep. The Oregon Coast, that he negotiated with the British. And he was very effective. But when he becomes the executive, the president, he just doesn't have that gravitas to make deals happen.
I was going to say, it's something like that it factor.
Yeah.
Washington had it. Jefferson had it. Roosevelt has it. But gravitas, we use that word a lot. I like that word. And he didn't carry himself like a leader would. He didn't have that commanding presence of grabbing a lectern and speaking. Maybe that's what it was. I'm not really sure.
It doesn't light up a room when he walks in.
No, not at all. I mean, he's kind of dull. He is intellectually brilliant, doesn't communicate that well with a common man. He's not a Washington. He's not going to grab the attention of the people.
But they say he was one of the most fittest presidents.
Yeah.
I understand that he would walk over 3 miles a day, and during his presidency would swim in the Potomac.
Yes.
Which is amazing to me.
Yes.
That anybody would swim in the Potomac. But you got to give again, the unique characteristics of each of our presidents has been, appropriate for the time in most cases, at least up to this point.
Yeah,
and when you look at his presidency, and from day one in presidency, Andrew Jackson was determined to defeat him.
And Jackson was a hard enemy to have. I mean, Jackson is a hardened military man, and when he came after you, he came after you. And Adams, by the way, you know this as well, is one that's interesting is he and his father are the only two one-term presidents up until this point.
That's exactly right.
So they share this in common.
Yeah. And when he's president, his father passes away on July 4th.
That's right.
You know, with Thomas Jefferson.
That's right.
It's just there's just so much intertwined there. That,
yeah,
that
and I believe it was McCullough who made the statement that when he is elected president, that his father actually wept because he realized the trouble that came with that office, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, to be president of the United States of America, all of the drama, all the politics, all of the issues, all of the war, all of the decisions that you'll make for life and death. And his father actually, he was proud of me. He wept knowing what he would go through. I think that's interesting.
It is interesting, but you also have to consider, you know, the influence of his mother, Abigail Adams.
That's good.
Because if we go back to when we did the podcast on John Adams, and if it wasn't for Abigail's letters that gave us the sense of what was going on, the history that she preserved in those letters, that had to have an influence on John Quincy Adams.
I totally agree.
And even though his wife was not an Abigail Adams, in fact, they may have been, you know, a little bit distant as a couple, but the influence of his mother probably weighed heavy on him.
Probably heavier than his father.
Yes.
In a lot of ways.
Because I think he understood the significance of the role of president. And here you have John Adams. When he's elected, he's the second president of the United States. And it's still in its maturing. And they haven't even moved to Washington, D.C. yet,
right.
you know. And now John Quincy Adams takes on a much bigger role with probably a lot more pressure than was there when his father was president.
That's a great draw. And if you think about like the kings of Israel, on the southern side, a lot of them had good fathers, but depending on who their mother was, usually played a role of how they interacted and had their faith. So maybe that's a great draw with John Quincy Adams. Not only did he have a good father, he had a really good mother.
Yes.
The hand that rocks the cradle
You're
rules
right.
the world.
You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's mom was very involved in his life.
In a huge way.
Yes.
In a huge way. So he's also the only, correct me if I'm wrong here, because obviously you're experienced in Congress, he's the only president who does not get reelected as a president and then goes back to House of Representatives and serves in Congress and will do that until he's 81? He'll die on the floor.
Yeah.
He'll literally have a stroke while he's on the floor in Congress.
And, you know, when I was in Congress, we would, of course, my staff would take any visitors that came to visit us a tour of the Capitol.
Okay.
And you go into what is now called Statuary Hall, which is the old House chamber, and they have a stone or a granite where his desk was placed.
Wow.
And they do this. The acoustics back then were so good that John Quincy Adams, would feign napping at his desk.
I read this.
And with his head down, and the acoustics were so good he could hear what other people were talking about.
Yes.
And learn what their strategies were in debates and things of that nature. It's fascinating. And in fact, that's what they do. When they go into the Capitol, they'll stand on one side of Statuary Hall and have the group stand on the other side, and they'll whisper, and you can actually hear it. You can experience the phenomenal acoustics that were there. But then also, back then, the Speaker's office was off to the back. And that's where they took John Quincy Adams when he had his stroke and then subsequently passed away. But that is amazing when you figure, here you are, you've been president for 4 years, you've lost re-election, go home, you know, and write your memoirs and leave us alone. No, I'm coming back to Congress, and for 18 years I'm going to haunt you in Congress because this is the way this nation needs to be run. That, to me, is the passion of a leader who believes in the divine design, if you will, to borrow Dr. Ingalls' phrase, of the United States. That we had to have leaders that knew and were committed to give the rest of their life to making sure this country, which was still in its infancy, was in the direction that was intended by the Founding Fathers.
And the humility to be able to step down from the executive office of president and then come back and work as a congressman. Like the humility that he had was huge.
I agree. The responsibility that you have as president, and now here you are, one back of, I don't know how many there were, 100 and some back then.
He's serving for what, Massachusetts?
Massachusetts, yeah.
Yeah, he served in
And
Massachusetts.
Previously, he had served in the U.S. Senate.
That is correct.
He lost his first race for the United States Congress, and then the Massachusetts legislature appoints him to the U.S. Senate, where he serves for 5 years, I think until 1808 or something, and then and then leaves early. But and he comes back to it. I mean. But his whole life was wrapped up in
public service.
Yes.
That's the way he saw it, was public service. He was called Old Man Eloquent as he served because of the eloquence of his speech, which I find really interesting. And I would dare say that he had a greater impact in Congress than he did as president.
I agree.
If you look at what he was able to do in Congress.
And he was a strong abolitionist.
I'm glad that you brought that up. That was one of the areas I was going to go. Of course, the case of the Amistad, right?
Yes.
One of the most famous areas where he does. And for those of you who are not familiar, the Amistad is a ship that kidnaps Africans because it's illegal to still sell with America at this point. Slavery isn't outlawed, but it has to be domestic slavery. It can't be slavery from Africa.
Right.
So the ship, the Amistad, kidnaps Africans, and they take them down to Cuba, which, 60 miles off the Floridian coast. and they're trying to sell them in Havana. However, there's a mutiny, or really just a rescue. I mean, we'll use the term rescue. It's not a mutiny. And these Africans, they break free. They kill the entire crew. They leave 2 alive. They want to bring them back to Africa, right? It's like an action movie waiting to be written.
Right.
The 2 that help them sail bring them up to the New England coast. And they end up running ashore around, I believe it's Connecticut. And there's a U.S. Schooner there. There's a naval vessel. They arrest him. They bring him in. And now it keeps getting pushed around. The Supreme Court has to decide what to do.
This is what's amazing about the Supreme Court, because of their decision in this case.
Yes.
I mean, here they are. These African soon-to-be slaves, if they stay in the United States, are petitioning for their freedom because they're not domestic slaves at the time.
No, they were kidnapped.
They were kidnapped, and the Supreme Court comes back in their favor.
Yes.
With John Quincy Adams
as the lead litigator in this.
Which is an amazing legacy.
Yes, they did a movie of this years ago, and I believe Anthony Hopkins plays, John Quincy Adams, and it's a lot of his litigation style as he spoke in front of the Supreme Court for the Amistad.
And you got to go back again to his father, who defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre, much to the disappointment of a lot of the patriots who didn't want to see that happen.
Especially people like Patrick Henry, who were so radical.
Yeah, and why are you doing it? But he did it for the preservation of the sanctity of the law.
Yeah, they believe in the law above all else.
Yes, the due process is foremost, and it passes through to the son, especially in this particular case, because he understands. Yes, he is a staunch abolitionist, as is Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a free state, but I think he sees this as probably one of the foremost legacies that he can leave. Is to make sure that he does his part to remove slavery as a terrible stain on the history of America.
Agreed. Yeah, and then 33 men, that's all that's left alive after the jailing and the mutinies and all this. 33 men are freed under John Quincy Adams and actually sent back to Sierra Leone, which is where they're from. And they go back. I mean, just an amazing, amazing story. And John Quincy Adams was one of the key players that actually made that happen.
Well, he was a fascinating president. Again, you wonder if he would have served it, because this is where he became very upset about partisan politics.
Yes, he did.
And he realized that he had to spend his whole presidency defending his initial election.
Yes.
And now we see that as a matter of course in all our presidential elections.
Yes.
Once you're elected, by golly, you didn't get there right. In fact, I believe it was Andrew Jackson who asserted that the election was stolen.
That's correct.
That
kind of rings true of the last several elections on both sides of.
So none of this is new, but how we handle it is what's really important.
Yes.
And how we survive it.
Yes.
And we were able to survive that, which worked out very well. If you're an Andrew Jackson fan, but it's all the course of history that we need to learn and know about.
Yes.
Because again, as we've talked about every one of these presidents up to this point, and as we will hereafter, they are all full of flaws,
Absolutely.
full of faults.
They're mortals.
Yes, they're like us.
Yes.
But yet, at times they rise to the occasion when we desperately need them. And John Quincy Adams came about at the right time in the history of this nation.
Yes.
Again, when you look back at his significant involvement in so many areas of foreign policy.
Yes.
And at a time when he was not only a fan of George Washington, but he believed in the isolationism.
That's right.
And then as time progressed, he realized, this may not work. This may not work.
I wrote this quote down going off of that because I think he is the bridge that kind of leads isolationism and goes to the birth of globalism. Not really there yet. But he said this: America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom of independence of all. That is a cool quote. We aren't going to conquer. We aren't going to look for monsters. We're just trying to make sure that everyone gets a fair shake at freedom. And
isn't that something?
It is. And it redefines the way that maybe we view some of our international wars. It wasn't we were going to conquer. We were literally trying to bring freedom to areas.
And I think we've lost that sense of objectivity.
Yes.
I think that we have spoiled our own minds by waiting to be told how to think. And I think that's a sickness that we have to individually work on so that we can excel in our own individual process of thought. And these guys, they back then they were rugged, but they were again craving knowledge and pursued it, and because of that, their ability to reason was phenomenal.
Yes.
And to do so in an objective fashion.
And I like where you're going with it because I think in partisan politics, the way it is now, if you're on the far right or the far left, you're told to follow the party line and never give it a second thought. And that's not what these men believed in. These men believed in the fact of thinking independently for themselves and actually coming up with good critical thought process. And we need that again, and we don't have that right now. Another thing about the Amistad case that was really interesting is that Martin Van Buren, who's the president at the time, he wants to send all the slaves back to Cuba because he wants some political capital with Spain at the time. And John Quincy Adams is like, we're not going to do that. I don't really care about politics. We're going to do the right thing. And I like that about him.
I would love to see that more often today.
No, it would not be the case.
It's the course that I think people want to see taken, but it's the course that is so hard to pursue because of the resistance and the internal fortitude that it takes.
And I think one of the reasons, too, is because you can't quantify those numbers for a campaign, right? You and I talked a lot about campaigning lately. And this idea of just saying, I'm going to stand for what's right, I'm going to do the right thing, how do you quantify that for a campaign? Like, it's not something that we use. Now everything's data, everything's laying things out.
You know, well put there, because I think that if you put your campaign at risk, if you put it on the line, if you're willing to do that, no matter the result, you will have your opportunity to prevail on what you believe your principles have driven you to.
I like that.
And I think that's where John Quincy Adams lives his life, because even though he lost his presidential run for re-election, he comes back to the House of Representatives and has even a more significant role in the development of this nation. And I mean, there's just positive lesson to be learned from there. You know, it could have been very easily for him to go back and just be relegated to the farm in Massachusetts, but he understood why he was there. And for those, I think, that are genuine leaders, they will put their election or re-election at risk in order to accomplish the objectives that they know are important, instead of just saying, hey, I just want to get reelected.
I like that. Yeah, because John Quincy Adams could have spent those 4 years crafting a reelection campaign, which is what we see a lot of times now, is the first 4 years, the first term, is just crafting a reelection campaign. I mean, I've even heard political commentators make the statement that you don't really do anything your first 4 years. You're just trying to get reelected, and then you bring your real change your last 4 years.
There's a lot of truth to that. As a lame duck, you know, you've got less to worry about in terms of raising campaign capital. You don't have to go out and placate your base.
Yes.
You know, you got 4 years to impose the policy that you firmly believe in.
You show your true colors a lot of times your second term. But when did that even switch off? Why don't we begin to show who we are as people of character at the very beginning? Why do we wait until, like, we're safe and then, oh, this is who I really am?
I think because so many are vested in that first election. And I think that, you know, we see it happen in executive orders after a president is elected and inaugurated. The first thing they do is a plethora of executive orders that tries to placate some of their base and create a message that furthers their campaign, and not only the campaign they just won, but the next one they have to go into. So it is the process that we know. I don't necessarily think it's healthy, but you know, we as the public, we as the electorate, as the consumers, we could demand otherwise and change the course of this nation.
Absolutely, but we have to think critically.
Yes.
That's what it comes down to.
And allow ourselves to independently think.
Yes. So I want to talk about his faith a little bit, because John Quincy Adams is a man of immense faith.
Yes.
You know, some of these presidents we come to, they're not very outspoken in their faith. John Quincy Adams is very outspoken in his faith. One of my favorite quotes he said, I want to read this to you. There are 3 points of doctrine, the belief of which forms the foundation of all morality. The first is the existence of God. The second is the immortality of the human soul. And the third is the future state of rewards and punishment. Suppose it possible for a man to disbelieve either or all 3 of these articles of faith, that man will have no conscience.
Amen.
He just kind of lays out the idea of, like, basic orthodoxy. And he says you have to believe there is a God, you have to believe that man is eternal, and you have to believe there is a reward and punishment system at the end of life. And he says if you discount any of that, you don't even have a conscience anymore.
That's frightening.
Isn't it?
Because there are a lot of people that are wanting to discount every bit of that.
Yes.
And not see that in their leaders.
No.
Which means we have an unconscionable leader.
Yes.
That they're seeking to have.
Yes. And if you remember, as we've been going through this, one of the things we see throughout these early founding fathers is this overwhelming sense of accountability at the end of their life, right? Washington had on his coffin, rise to judgment. It's one of the things that put on his coffin, like praise to God, but rise to judgment.
Right.
There was always this idea in the back of their mind they were accountable to someone higher than them, and that was going to come at the end of their life. And I think that kept them honest and filled with integrity in this power position. But if you honestly believe that you don't have anyone you're accountable to, then you can do whatever in the heck you want to do when you're reigning.
You know, I believe it was his father who commented on the Constitution saying that it was made for a virtuous people.
That's right.
And
That's right.
And it still holds true today. And you know, our virtue is instilled through our faith.
Yes.
And we can't lose sight of that.
Yes.
Mean, it is the probably most necessary fabric that what weaves us together as a nation and as individuals.
Yes.
So
agreed. He was also a great explorer. As you know from your time in D.C., he is one of the founders of the Smithsonian.
Yes.
He leads the Smithsonian being built. And one of the things I found really interesting, I was just really diving into his letters and some of his things, is he actually invested during his presidency in the research of a man by the name of John Clive Sims. Now, Sims believed, you got to get this, it shows you how far we've come. Sims believed the earth was hollow.
Huh.
And he believed that there was actually land to buy and to propagate inside the earth.
Interesting.
And he believed that these entrance points were at the North and South Pole.
Of course.
So, yeah, I mean, why not? Right? I mean, let's go with it. So, actually, John Quincy Adams finances this during his presidency for him to actually take a voyage.
Did not know that.
Yes, to the poles to try to find the inner, what they call the hollow earth that he was going to basically take for America, right? Like, if we're buying up land, let's buy the middle of the earth, too.
Let's get the basement.
Yeah, why not, right? Maybe it's a basement sale, basement prices. And actually, the only reason why this voyage doesn't happen is because when Jackson comes to power, he just scraps everything that Adams ever did, and the voyage is scrapped. And obviously, you know, now we realize how dumb that really is. That you know, Jules Verne actually, of course, writes Journey to the Center of the Earth 50 years later, and some of this was off of the research. It's fictional by that point, but it's off of the research of Sims.
I had no idea about that.
That's your like weird history fact for the day. Yeah. So, but John Quincy Adams, man who loved science, but man who was a man of deep faith. I want to close with this quote. You tell me your thoughts on this. The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity.
I think that is not only profound, but deeply factual.
Yes.
And here's a man that saw the Battle of Bunker Hill from his home at age 10.
Yes.
He was deeply involved in the Revolutionary War, not as a soldier, but as a young citizen. And I think that as a man who, as you pointed out, was very strong in his faith, understands the connection and the need for the connection between a civil nation and a deep-seated faith in a creator and an afterlife. As you pointed out, I think he got it very well.
Yeah.
And again, in order to balance, you know, the separation of church and state, he did an exceptional job in doing that.
And I think probably because of his faith, because of his belief that all men were created equal and all men had a soul that would live on forever, I think it's one of the things that drove him so hard in his cause of abolitionism. He wanted to see people free. He wanted to see people who were created in the image of God have the ability to live free because he knew he'd spend eternity with them.
Amen to that.
Their soul is immortal. And I think that's what led to his belief.
Yeah.
For sure. This has been John Quincy Adams. And next week, we actually will go on Andrew Jackson. Man, what a hard man he was. What a military man.
What a populist.
What a populist. So looking forward to next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.